Have you ever watched the Clone Wars and thought, where were each of these battles fought? How were they connected and how does this all link together to make an effective military campaign? Today I will map out the Republic's military machine and how it was ultimately all designed to fail. So make some tea and get your hand off that grass because we are going deep. Why did I write that? Let's start with that first point because the Clone Wars is not a single conflict like the Western Front, a big back and forth slugging match, but a series of smaller battles all raging simultaneously. It is the Clone Wars, after all. I'll try and break it down simply and I hope you can keep up. Not long after the first battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, the Republic divided the galaxy into 20 sectors, each garrisoned by a sector army. As you can see, each of them contained 147,000 clones. Here is the distribution of those armies. In the core world, there were 6 sector armies. Each sector would be assigned a headquarters world. So, for example, the 3rd sector army would have their headquarters on Chandrilla. Why do I recognise that? This headquarters would be called Steel Blade Command. I do have an award-winning video on the structure of the Grand Army of the Republic, but just to summarise the rough system, each sector army contained 4 cores. So each sector would have a garrison of 4 cores. Each of 36,000 clones. Apart from Coruscant, which had its own core, the sometimes loved and absolutely terrifying boys in red. Interestingly, although Coruscant fell within Azure Hammer Command, the command of the 1st Sector Army, the headquarters for this sector army was on Anaxis, not Coruscant. The only explanation I can think for this is that the Republic High Command wanted to separate the authority of the entire GAR, commanded from Coruscant, and the command for the local sector army on Anaxis. But if you have a better explanation, then please let me know. Before I mention the northern and southern sector armies, I should mention that the 6 sector armies in the core worlds were designed as reserve armies to be used as rapid reaction forces to plug gaps and assist in offensives where necessary. Although, as with every army in the Clone Wars, the entire sector army would never be deployed to a single world at once. So I can imagine a situation where sector armies in the core worlds would have one of its 4 cores in deployment somewhere else, 1 or 2 training and another resting. And that core that was on deployment somewhere in the galaxy was most likely broken up and sent around the galaxy as needed in much smaller formations. A medical battalion over there, a flame trooper company attached to the invasion of Geonosis for some Republic war crimes over there. Let's have a look at the southern sector armies. This is the largest grouping in any galactic quadrant with 8 sector armies. As you have probably noticed, the Republic did not have full control of each of the worlds in a sector. This is why the sector armies' headquarters would be on stable worlds loyal to the Republic. And unlike the 6 core sectors, the sector armies on the frontiers were fully operational garrison forces, meaning the 4 cores in each of these sectors would always be on deployment, garrisoning important worlds from Republic bases if they were lucky, roughing it out in a tent if they weren't. This could explain why whenever we see sector armies in the mid and outer rims, they are often just there to hold the line long enough for Republic reinforcements from the core worlds to assist them. I'm not saying that these clones are inferior or lack the battlefield knowledge to defend their sectors effectively, but they just serve a different strategic purpose. Not only is this a reasonable and logical tactic from Republic High Command, you could compare it to any real-world army that was defending a large frontier. I think the Eastern Roman Empire is actually a perfect example because we all, obviously, always think about the Eastern Roman Empire, and it's not the Byzantine Empire. They're very different. Don't try me. The most well-equipped and professional field armies would sit either side of the Bosphorus, ready to be sent out to the frontiers, with smaller regional armies able to plug the gaps and stop any large Sassanid incursions, with the frontier forts designed to simply slow down large armies and stop bandit raids being garrisoned by the Limitani, who were just expected to hold the line as long as they could. This Limitani role is the equivalent of the Planetary Defense Force, which I won't cover here because they don't sit within the GAR structure, but as you can probably guess, they were made up of local citizen militia who would act as the first line of defense for the Republic against separatist attacks. And don't just take my word for it, although you definitely should. We see this during the Battle of Christophsis, where the 13th Sector Army of Iron Lance Command is simply stationed on Christophsis to slow down the separatist invasion. Although, admittedly, the weak garrison force of a few lightly armed clones of the 13th Sector Army and some local Christophsian militia was probably part of the reason the Separatists thought they could easily take the planet, but that's an argument for another time. As you can see, this small force is able to hold on just long enough to prevent Separatist General Warren Volosum from establishing an even larger Separatist presence on Christophsis, allowing for the 501st Legion and 7th Sky Corps from the core worlds, probably alongside some local elements, the 13th Sector Army, to land and recapture the planet. I should also mention how Hutt space interacts with the Sector Armies' authority. Although the Hutts have a lot of influence over large swathes of the eastern, outer and mid rims, they were very good at playing both sides of the Clone Wars and being at the very least not outright hostile to either side. So although on this map it looks as if Iron Lance Command control this entire area, they don't, nor would they ever be able to. If the Republic tried to assert dominance by garrisoning Hutt worlds or worlds under their direct or commercial influence, it would risk the Hutts preferring to look the other way to any separatist trespassing. Or it could be much worse, the Hutts after all do have some interesting forms of punishment. Now with the power of hindsight, it was all being coordinated behind the scenes by Palpatine, but we'll get back to that point a bit later. And that brings us to the northern quadrant. Now you may ask how each of these are quadrant if there are only 3 of them, and to that I say, good question, welcome to Clone Wars military logistics. There were 6 in the north. These are probably the most important sectors in terms of the great campaigns of the Clone Wars, and this is where most of the Outer Rim sieges took place, as the Republic chased the Separatists further and further back into the Outer Rim. Unlike in the south, where most of the key battles of the war were fought along key hyperspace lanes, the fight for the north of the galaxy was much more spread out and akin to a more conventional frontier, hence my analogy earlier. And that is how the clone army was spread around the galaxy. 20 armies, each of 4 cores, of 36,000 clones each, 147,000 clones per sector, 3 million clones in all. Let me clear up some weird logistical quirks of the system. Of that 147,000 clones per sector, this includes the naval forces. It's generally assumed that each sector had its own central fleet. You may be confused as to where all those crew for the navy come from. Given the 4 cores of a sector army, you're sort of implied to all be infantry ground units. And to that I say, good question. Welcome to Clone Wars military logistics. I think that sums up the sector army system quite well, and the distribution of the clone army around the galaxy. But to fight a battle, you have to be there. I wanted to dedicate at least one segment to the very underappreciated role of the hyperspace lanes. Hyperspace lanes are a bit of a pain to explain, but instead of imagining them placed on top of the galaxy, imagine it the other way around. The only reason Coruscant is the most important planet in the galaxy is its placement at the heart of the already mapped hyperspace lanes. Remember, there are thousands of smaller lanes that connect varying regions of the galaxy, but the only ones you need to know are what are known as the super hyper routes: the Palimian trade route, the Corellian run, Corellian trade spine, the Hydian way, and the Rimmer trade route. There is also the secret Nexus route, which was used by Grievous to attack Coruscant, but since it was only used once, we don't need to bother with that. The reason the Separatists were able to launch attacks on planets seemingly in the heart of the Republic's territory is probably because they sat on the Hydian way, or actually any hyperspace lane, because the Hydian way had junctions with every other hyperspace route. This is what makes the sector army system we saw earlier a flawed system in practice. It was not territory that mattered in the Clone Wars, but the super hyper route, and especially the junctions between them. Here's an example of just how important they were. Say you had an armed and ready Separatist army on Raxus, in the heart of Separatist territory, and you want to attack, say, Christophsis, well, it's almost as if that actually happened. You could swoop down the Permilian trade route, get off at Anaxis, onto the Hydian way, take that down to Denon, slip onto the Corellian run, straight down, and boom. Fight for just one street in one city and lose to a much smaller Republic counter-invasion force. Warm Losum, ladies and gentlemen, a true Separatist genius. Now that is greatly oversimplified, mainly because the exits of the hyperspace lanes were very small areas that could be heavily guarded, meaning as soon as you left hyperspace at Anaxis, you would be surrounded by the Azure Hammer 1 sector reserve fleet, but you could give it a go. I hope that goes some way to explaining why the Clone Wars were fought in these very concentrated regions, and why although the Separatists had most of their military strength in the north, how they're able to fight the Republic and hold ground so far from their traditional territories. All of this is to say that whenever we come across inconsistencies or bad strategy in the Clone Wars, we have a very easy scapegoat as to why. That's just how Palpatine thought best to cause chaos, to be eventually able to take over the galaxy. It's a very boring answer, but it'll have to do for basically basically everything. So when you were asked how the Clone Wars was won, or let's be honest, you want to tell someone how the Clone Wars was won, you can answer, I don't have a clue. And also, if you play Star Wars Battlefront 2, since it's on the rise again for the first time in what seems like a very long time, and you want to play with a large group of other people where we play daily games in big groups on Xbox, PC, or PlayStation, then I really recommend check out the 104th Battalion Milsim. It's a group I've been a part of for many years, and I think if you like this, you might actually enjoy it. We occasionally win, which is, always a bonus. The link is in the description. But apart from that, I've been Rhino, and I'll see you around.